My name is Declan. I worked as a night security guard for 3 years at a mid-sized shopping center outside of Galway, Ireland, a place called the Tuam Shopping Center. I don't work there anymore, and if you give me a few minutes, I'll tell you exactly why. The job was about as uneventful as you'd expect. 8 hours, most nights, of walking the same corridors, checking the same fire exits, watching the same empty storefronts go dark. You get used to it. After a few months, you stop hearing the hum of the ventilation system. You stop noticing the way your footsteps sound different in different parts of the building. You stop looking twice at every shadow the emergency lighting throws across the floor. That was probably my first mistake. Stopping looking twice. The night of November 17th, 2009 started like every other Tuesday night shift. I clocked in at 10, did my first walk of the perimeter, poured myself a coffee from the thermos I always brought in from home, and settled into the monitor room to watch the CCTV feeds cycle through. 32 cameras covering every corridor, every entrance, every stairwell and service exit in the building. I knew every angle by memory. I could tell you which camera had the slight fisheye distortion on the upper left corner, which one flickered if the temperature dropped below a certain point in the car park. You spend enough nights in a room like that, you learn its habits. I was on the second hour of my shift when camera 14 caught something it shouldn't have. Camera 14 covers the lower escalators. The 2 escalators that connect the ground floor retail level to the upper food court, which by November was already half shut for the season. At 2:13 in the morning, with every shutter down and every light on a timer already off, there was a figure on camera 14, walking slowly, moving from the top of the stationary escalator toward the bottom landing, moving deliberately, not rushing, not looking around the way someone lost or panicked would look around. Just walking, head slightly down, hands at its sides. My first thought was a rough sleeper. It had happened twice before in the 3 years I'd been there. Someone slipping in behind a delivery truck or finding a door a contractor hadn't properly secured. Protocol was clear. I radioed the desk, noted the time, picked up my torch, and went to investigate. The walk from the monitor room to the lower escalators takes about 4 minutes if you go directly. I did not go directly. I came in from the service corridor that lets out behind the ground floor pharmacy, so I'd be approaching from the east side rather than walking straight up the main avenue where anyone waiting could see me coming. You learn that quickly in this job. You don't announce yourself until you have to. I came around the corner and swept my torch across the escalator landing. Nothing. No one on the escalators. No one on the ground floor between the escalators and the shuttered stores. I stood there for a moment and listened. The ventilation, my own breathing, the faint creak of the building settling in the cold. Nothing else. I checked both sets of escalators. I checked the disabled access lift adjacent to them. I walked the full ground floor from east to west, checking each service door and fire exit as I went. Every single one was locked from the inside. The external alarm contacts were all showing green on my handheld unit. No breach, no open point, nothing triggered, nothing forced. I went back to the monitor room and rewound camera 14 to the 2:13 timestamp. The figure was there. You could see it clearly. A person walking down the escalator, head down, arms at the sides. The image quality wasn't perfect. It never is with the older analog systems, but it was unambiguous. A human shape in motion. I watched it walk. I watched it reach the bottom of the escalator. I watched it step off onto the landing. and then it wasn't there anymore. Not walking out of frame, not turning a corner, not stepping into a shadow. It was there on one frame and absent on the next. No blur, no trail, nothing to suggest that it moved so fast the camera simply couldn't track it. It was present, and then it was gone, and the timestamp between those two states was less than a single second. I sat in that chair for a long time after that. I went back through every camera that covered the surrounding area. Camera 11, which covers the main avenue approaching the escalators from the north. Camera 17, pointed at the south approach. Cameras 9 and 23 covering the fire exit corridors. Camera 28 looking down from the upper level. I went through all of them. That exact window of time, frame by frame. Camera 14 was the only one that recorded anything. That part is what I keep coming back to. A person, a real person, a physical object moving through a physical space would appear on more than one camera. The angles overlap. That's the whole point of the system, the redundancy, the coverage. Whatever walked down those escalators at 2:13 in the morning on November 17th was visible to exactly one camera from exactly one angle for exactly as long as it took to reach the bottom and step off. And then it chose to stop being visible. I finished the shift. I don't entirely know how, but I did. I wrote up the incident report factually, included the timestamp, noted the camera number, noted that my physical check of the area returned nothing, and that all access points were secured. I handed it in at the end of my shift and I drove home. And I sat in my car in my own driveway for 20 minutes before I went inside. I spoke to my supervisor about the footage 2 days later. He reviewed it. He didn't say much. He told me the recording would be archived and that they'd look into the camera for a possible fault. He used that word, fault. Like the camera had malfunctioned in a way that produced a person, like cameras do that. The footage was archived. I was told it would be kept as part of the incident record. As far as I know, it was never reviewed by anyone else, never handed to the police, never made public. There was nothing to make public, technically. No crime, no trespassing complaint that could be substantiated, just 38 seconds of a figure that had no business being there, doing something that had no rational explanation. I handed in my notice 2 weeks later. I told my supervisor it was for personal reasons, which was true enough. I could not make myself go back into that monitor room and sit in front of those screens for 8 hours, knowing what I'd seen on them, knowing what the building had shown me and what it had decided not to explain. I still think about the moment it stepped off the escalator, the way it moved, unhurried, like it had all the time it needed. Like it already knew I was on my way down to look for it, like the whole point wasn't to be found, just to be seen. My name is Renata. I worked nights in a regional hospital in central Poland for 11 years. The ward I was assigned to for most of that time was the 3rd floor. General medical, 12 beds on each side of the corridor, mostly elderly patients recovering from cardiac events or post-surgical complications. It was not a glamorous posting. It was steady, exhausting, and mostly quiet once the building settled down past midnight. I am not someone who believed in things she could not explain. I want to establish that before I tell you what happened, because people tend to dismiss accounts like this by deciding beforehand what kind of person is telling them. I was 41 years old when this occurred. I had worked nights long enough to know that hospitals after dark produce sounds and impressions that can make rational people briefly irrational. The building breathes differently at night. Pressure changes in the ventilation. the specific silence of a corridor where everyone is either sleeping or sedated. These things can create a kind of noise in the mind that is not actually there. I knew all of this. I believed all of it. The incident happened on the night of March 3rd, 2002, beginning at approximately 3:27 in the morning. I was at the nurse's station at the center of the third floor corridor when the call panel registered an alert from room 307. The call panel was an older system analog, a row of numbered indicator lights above the desk, each one wired directly to the call button mounted beside the bed in its corresponding room. When a patient pressed their button, the light for their room number lit up and a soft tone sounded at the station. You acknowledged the alert, went to the room, dealt with whatever was needed, and reset the button at the bedside. Simple, reliable. The system had been in service since the early 1980s, and in my experience rarely produced false signals. Room 307 had been empty since the second week of January. A patient had been discharged from that room. The bed had been stripped, and the room had remained unoccupied for reasons I was not entirely clear on. I had heard something about a plumbing issue in the adjacent bathroom that was scheduled for repair, but hadn't been dealt with yet. The room was closed. The door had a small paper notice taped to it, handwritten, noting that the room was out of service. When the indicator for 307 lit up at 3:27 that morning, my first assumption was a system fault. I acknowledged the alert, reset the panel, and noted the time in the desk log. 9 minutes later, the light came on again. I reset it again. 7 minutes after that again. At this point, I assumed something was physically wrong with the call button in the room. A short in the wiring, a stuck mechanism, something mechanical causing the circuit to complete repeatedly. I noted it for the maintenance log and moved on. By 4:15, the alert had fired 6 times in total. Each time I reset it. Each time it returned. My colleague Marta came on for a brief overlap near the end of her break, and I mentioned the 307 alerts to her. She looked at the panel and shrugged. "Probably the wiring," she said. Then the light came on again, while we were both standing there looking at it, and she stopped shrugging. We looked at each other. She said, "Go and check the room." I told her I'd already assumed there was no one in it. She said, "Go and check the room." The corridor between the nurse's station and room 307 is 41 steps. I have walked it more times than I can count. At 4 in the morning, with the overhead lights dimmed to their overnight level, it has a particular quality. The linoleum reflects the ceiling lights in long, pale strips, and the closed doors on either side are all identical. And the sound of your own footsteps is extremely clear. I was aware of every one of mine. As I walked toward the end of the corridor, the paper notice was still on the door. I knocked twice, which I recognized as absurd even as I was doing it. Then I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room had no overhead light switched on. The only light came from the corridor behind me and from the small green standby indicator on the call button unit mounted to the wall beside the bare mattress. That indicator is always lit when the unit is powered. It simply shows the system is active. Green means ready. It had been green, presumably, since the room was last used in January, except that it was not green. It was amber. Amber on that system means the button has been pressed and the call is active. I stood in the doorway of an empty room at 4:19 in the morning looking at an amber call indicator on a unit that had no patient within 30 meters of it. And while I stood there, it stopped. The amber faded. The light returned to green. I watched it happen. It took perhaps 4 seconds. And then it was simply a standby light again in an empty room, and the corridor behind me was completely silent. I went back to the nurse's station. I told Marta what I had seen. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said she was going to log it as a suspected electrical fault. And I agreed that this was what she should do. I finished my shift. I drove home in the gray early morning, and I sat in my kitchen for a long time before I could sleep. The following afternoon, I came back for my next shift to find a note in the log from the day maintenance team. Someone had finally gone to look at the room 307 call unit that morning. The note read, "Unit inspected, wiring to call station found, disconnected at junction box, system isolated, no current reaching panel, origin of previous alerts, unclear. The wiring had been disconnected." Maintenance believed it had been that way for some time, possibly since the plumbing work that had taken the room out of service weeks earlier. The unit in room 307 had been drawing no current from the panel. There was no electrical path by which it could have lit an alert at the nurse's station, let alone lit one 6 times across the span of 45 minutes. There is no part of that I have ever been able to account for. I have held the factual record of it in my mind for more than 20 years, and I cannot find the seam in it. The room was empty. The wiring was dead. The alerts happened anyway, over and over, until whatever needed to be seen had been seen. Room 307 was eventually repaired and returned to service the following spring. I continued working that ward for another 4 years without incident. But I will tell you honestly that I never walked that corridor at night again without counting every one of those 41 steps and listening very carefully to what was on the other side of the silence. My name is Gerald. I worked the overnight shift at a corrugated metal fabrication plant in rural Pennsylvania for close to 6 years. The plant operated around the clock, 3 rotating shifts, about 40 workers per rotation. But by the time the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. crew was down to skeleton staffing in the early hours, the building had a way of feeling like something built to hold far more people than were actually inside it. The plant floor was large enough that a single worker could spend an entire shift in one section without crossing into another. Press stations, roll forming lines, cut-off machines, a paint bay at the far east end, a loading dock that ran the full length of the south wall. The noise during active production hours was constant and physical. You felt it in your back teeth. After midnight, with most of the heavy equipment idle, the silence that replaced it was its own kind of oppressive. You became aware very quickly of every sound that didn't belong. I want to be precise about the date because I have gone over it many times in my own memory. It was the night of October 12th, 2013, beginning sometime around 1:40 in the morning. I was doing a routine check of the east section that night. My job title was maintenance technician, which meant that during the dead hours of the shift when production was paused for a scheduled retooling, I was responsible for walking each section of the floor to check equipment, note anything that needed attention before the morning crew came on, and log it in the maintenance book we kept at the supervisor's station. It was solitary work. I was accustomed to it. The east section was the quietest part of the plant at night. The roll-forming machines there were the oldest in the building, a line of 6 units running north to south, each about 20 feet long, bolted to a concrete pad, connected by a narrow service walkway that ran the length of the line. I had walked that walkway hundreds of times. I knew every inch of it. I was about 2/3 of the way down the walkway, torch in hand, making notes on my clipboard, when I heard something behind me. Footsteps. On the metal grating of the walkway, deliberate, evenly spaced, the particular sound of work boots on open steel mesh. I know that sound because I made it myself with every step I took. And whatever was behind me was making the exact same sound, slow, unhurried, following the same line I was walking. I stopped. The footsteps stopped. I turned around. The walkway behind me was empty all the way back to the entrance of the section. The overhead fluorescence ran the full length of the room, and there was nowhere on that walkway where someone could have been standing and not been visible to me. Nothing was there. I stood for a moment, listened. The plant around me was silent. The low electrical hum of the equipment on standby, the faint rattle of the ventilation in the ceiling, nothing else. I turned back and continued walking. I made it perhaps another 10 feet. The footsteps started again. This time I did not stop gradually. I spun around fast, the way you do when some part of your body makes a decision before your mind catches up with it. The walkway was empty. I shone the torch down both sides of the roll-forming line between the machines into the gap between the last unit and the east wall. Nothing. No one. Here's the part I have difficulty with even now, because it is the part that removes every rational explanation I have been able to construct in the years since. I had a chest-mounted work camera that night. The plant had introduced them about 8 months earlier for liability documentation during maintenance work. A small body cam unit, wide-angle, continuous recording. I wore it on every shift without thinking much about it. It was simply part of the uniform. When I reviewed the footage the following day, I watched myself walking the east section walkway. I watched myself stop the first time. I watched myself turn around. The walkway behind me was clear. I could confirm that much. But in the frame just before I turned, in the fraction of a second before my body completed the rotation, there is something in the image that I have watched back more times than I can count, and have never been able to explain. Behind me, at the far end of the walkway near the section entrance, there is a shape. It is upright. It is roughly human in proportion. It is standing completely still, and it is not casting a shadow the way every other object in that frame is casting a shadow under the fluorescent lights. And in the very next frame, a fraction of a second later, as my turn completes, it is not there. The walkway is empty. No blur of movement, no exit. It is present and then it is absent. And there is nothing in between those two states. I did not sleep well for some time after watching that footage. I did not tell anyone at the plant about what I had seen on the recording. Partly because I did not know how to describe it in terms that would make sense to a reasonable person, and partly because I needed to keep working that job, and I was not willing to be the maintenance tech who quit night duty over a camera artifact. That is what I told myself it was for a while. A camera artifact. A compression error. A problem with the lens or the sensor that produced an image that looked like a figure but was in fact nothing. I held on to that explanation for about 2 months until I mentioned what had happened to an older worker named Paul, who had been at the plant since it opened in 1987. I told him about the footsteps and where on the walkway they had happened, and Paul was quiet for a long moment. Then he told me that a worker had been killed in the east section in 1994, a man named Raymond Gruber. A belt drive on one of the old roll formers had failed during a night shift. Raymond had been alone in the section at the time. Paul said his name the way you say the name of someone you actually knew. Then he picked up his coffee and walked away. and we never talked about it again. I finished out my time at that plant and moved on for other reasons. But I still have the footage. I have watched it more times than is probably good for me. And I do not know what Raymond Gruber's death has to do with what I heard and what my camera recorded on the night of October 12, 2013. I only know that the east section walkway was not as empty as it appeared, and that whatever was back there knew enough to stop when I stopped, and to wait when I waited, and to vanish the instant I turned around fast enough to almost catch it. My name is Kwan. I drove a taxi in Seoul for 19 years. I am retired now. My son thinks I should not talk about this publicly, but I am 63 years old, and I am not particularly concerned with what people choose to believe about me. I drove nights almost exclusively for the last 8 years of my career. The night shift suited me. Less traffic, fewer difficult passengers, a certain kind of quiet that the daytime city never offers. I knew Seoul after midnight the way a person knows the layout of their own home, instinctively, without needing to think about it. Every neighborhood, every shortcut, and every street that looked serviceable but wasn't. Every bridge approach that backed up after rain. I was a professional. I was good at the job. The incident I am going to describe happened on the night of September 18th, 2012. I remember the date because I wrote it in a personal journal I kept at the time, and because I have had cause to look at that entry more than once in the years since. I had finished what I thought was my last run for the night around 12:30 in the morning. A fare from the Mapo district back toward Jongno, easy route, unremarkable passenger, standard tip. I was planning to head back toward the depot. I had my indicator on to make a left turn that would have taken me onto the main artery back south, when I noticed a fare standing on the pavement about 40 meters ahead of me on the opposite side of the road. She was a woman, standing very still. One arm raised in the gesture you make to flag a taxi, though something about the stillness of it seemed wrong to me even then. Most people flag a cab with movement, with some urgency. She simply had her arm up, motionless, like a figure in a photograph. She was wearing a gray coat, and her hair was dark and long and wet-looking, though it had not been raining that evening. I pulled alongside her and lowered the window. She got in without speaking. Passengers do this. It is not unusual. I asked her where she was going, and she gave me an address in the Yunpyeong district, which was north of where we were, not a complicated route, maybe 25 minutes at that hour. I repeated it back to her to confirm, and she said yes, quietly. I noted that her voice was flat in a way I could not quite characterize. Not hostile, not drowsy, simply without the usual texture that voices carry. I pulled out and headed north. She did not speak again after that initial exchange. I watched her occasionally in the rearview mirror, which is habit, not suspicion. You track your passengers as a matter of routine awareness. She was sitting with her hands in her lap, looking out the side window. Her reflection in the glass of the door was faint, and I could not make out her expression clearly. She appeared to be a woman in her mid-30s. The back of the cab had a slight smell that I noticed after a few minutes. Something cold and damp, like clothing that had been wet for a long time and not properly dried. We drove. I said nothing. She said nothing. I took the Han River Bridge north as the most direct route, and I remember as we crossed it, she did not look at the water, which is what most passengers do almost involuntarily when crossing at night. She kept her face turned toward the door window away from the river. We came off the bridge approach, and I was navigating the northern streets toward Unpyeong. when my GPS unit gave me a flag I had not seen before. The address she had provided was returning as unverifiable, not simply as a street number that didn't exist within the range, but as a street name that had no record in the mapping system at all. I had a current system. I updated it regularly. In 19 years, I had encountered bad data, deprecated addresses, new construction that outpaced the maps. This was different. The street name itself was not in the database. I glanced in the mirror to ask her to clarify, and I said her address back to her, framing it as a question. Was she certain of the street name? She didn't answer. I looked more carefully in the mirror. She was still in the same position facing the door window. I assumed she had not heard me. I raised my voice slightly and repeated the question. Nothing. I pulled over. This is something you learn to do when a situation becomes unclear. You stop the vehicle and you resolve it from a position of control rather than while moving. I put the car in park, turned slightly in my seat, and looked directly into the back. The seat was empty. Her bag was not there. There was no impression in the seat cushion. There was no evidence that anyone had been sitting there for the preceding 22 minutes of the journey. The only thing that remained was the cold, damp smell, which was stronger now, and which seemed to linger for another 30 seconds or so before it faded. The doors had not opened. I have driven that vehicle for 4 years. I know the sound of its doors. I know the sound of the mechanism when a door handle is pressed from the inside. I had heard none of those sounds. There had been no movement, no shift in the car's balance, no sound of a door seal breaking. She was simply not there anymore. I sat in the parked car for some time. I cannot tell you how long exactly. I looked at the meter, which was still running, the way it does when a vehicle is stationary during a fair. I turned it off. I wrote down the address she had given me on the notepad I kept on the dash. I noted the time, 12:58 in the morning. When I got home that night, I looked up the street name from memory, using a different search. I found one reference to it in a neighborhood planning document from 1970 describing streets in a section of Unpyeong that had been demolished and rebuilt during the city's rapid development in the mid-1970s. The street had existed. It did not exist anymore. It had not existed for nearly 40 years. I drove taxis for another 3 years after that night. I worked days,